This is Jim Cason with Riverbend Fellowship in Riverbend, North Carolina. We're continuing with the prophetic series, Things Which Were, Things Which Are, and Things to Come. This is the 48th in that series for the 1st of August, 2021. And we're now in chapter 12 of Revelation. Now the structure of Revelation is such that the first chapter is somewhat introductory. The second and third chapters dealt with the seven churches. And from the fourth up through the 11th, John gets called up to heaven, and it appears to be more or less a linear progression of things that happen as we would perceive it in time. But we have what I'd choose to call a parenthesis here, where for the next several chapters, this straightforward approach of the worship of God, then the seven first judgments, then the second judgments proceeds to happen. But there's a pause in John's revelation where this chapter and the others are before the last seven of the great judgments, where the wrath of God is poured out. There's been an awful lot of discussion among Bible students over the years and centuries as to the meaning of these chapters. They get what some people call more fanciful in their terms of illustration. Personally, I think God realized that John had seen so much already and so much destruction on the earth and so many people dying during the last chapters that he wanted to prepare him for this. And I really think that this prophecy here goes all the way from the beginning and all the way through, and it's not really dealing with time as much. So let's start with it. Verse 1, Now a great sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, S-U-N, and with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Then, being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. Okay, so some of the theories on this was, over the centuries, was that this was Mary. Well, she wasn't a sign that appeared in heaven. Clothed with the sun, and this is not speaking of Ra, the Egyptian sun god, with the moon under her feet. I tend to think this is illustrating that this particular woman in this prophecy is in between heaven and earth. On her head a garland of 12 stars. Well, where we find 12 used scripturally is a couple of different places. It was used because Jesus had 12 primary disciples, right? There were others also that followed along that were students, but he had 12 primary disciples. And one of those was faithless. I tend myself to believe that these 12 stars are the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, there is some Old Testament support for this. Joseph, in his statement about his dream, spoke about the sun and the moon and the 12 other heavenly bodies, and that dream where he took over all of them, and his brothers really hated it. His mom and dad weren't too happy with it either, because his father was the sun, his mother was the moon, and the 12 others were all 12 brothers. At any rate, we know that this woman is with child. She's crying out in labor and in pain to give birth. This is one of the most painful experiences for humanity, is giving birth. I don't think it would have been prior to the fall, but it is now. And that was also prophesied by God way back in Genesis. It's a tremendous pain. The only thing any male has ever had to suffer like it. As far as the degree of pain is probably the passing of kidney stones, and that's not as bad. So what's happening? She's pregnant with a child. She's in labor. That means the child is going to be coming pretty soon. Verse 3, another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his heads. Now this dragon, we know from other biblical interpretation, refers primarily to the great enemy, Lucifer, Satan. The 7 heads and 10 horns, Satan he doesn't really know all that's going to happen. He doesn't have that gift of knowing everything from the beginning. No created being does. Although he's going to be eternal, he doesn't know what's going to happen next. You want proof of that? If he had known what was going to happen next, there's no way under the sun that he would have stirred up the Jews and the Romans to have Jesus crucified. Because if Jesus had just lived a normal life and then passed of old age, 2 things would have happened. For one thing, I don't think Christianity would have developed. But more important, that sacrifice had to be made to redeem the earth and its population that had been lost to the snake back in the Garden of Eden. So that's the 7 heads. The 10 horns. Horns typically are used as representatives of kings in government. You could also interpret this based on what we know about the tribulation period and the world government that will happen, that there are 10 primary provinces, as it were, or what we would call nations or states. There were 10 primary provinces in the original Roman government, which tend to support that. 7 diadems on his heads. Well, he's trying to imitate God. A diadem is a fancy crown. I'm not talking about something like a Burger King crown. I'm talking about the kind of crown that real true royalty wears. And man, you think that's a lot. He's got 7 of them, so he's 7 kings. Well, Jesus has got multitudes of them. We know that also from Revelation. Verse 4, his tail drew 1/3 of the stars from heaven and threw them to the earth. Well, 1/3 of the angels that God had created followed Satan. They were thrown to the earth. He still, up to the point that we're getting to, was able to travel back and forth, because the word also says that he went to God against the saints, bad-mouthing them, acting as a prosecutor. Look what Job's done. He does not deserve your favor. He does not deserve salvation. And we know that that puppy's not going to hunt anymore, because we have the blood of Jesus and the forgiveness. So what's this dragon going to do? Verse 4. We started off with the 1/3 of the stars. This continues. The dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth to devour her child as soon as it was born. Now, some have interpreted this as meaning that the woman was from Israel, representing Mary, and the child was Christ. But Satan didn't stand a chance of being able to devour Christ. One of the other interpretations is that this child that's represented here is representative of the church in general, speaking both of the New Testament church and, for that matter, the saints that were in the Old Testament. So let's find out what's going to happen here. Verse 5, she bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. Well, that tells us who the child is, right? Who's going to rule all the nations with a rod of iron? We know the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Emmanuel, Jesus, Jesus, the Messiah, is going to rule all the nations. Her child was caught up to God and his throne. Well, that certainly could apply to Jesus. What happened after the resurrection was Jesus spent about 40 days here, and then he was continuing his teaching, and then he went up to the mountain and he got carried up to heaven and his throne. Verse 6, and then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. So God already prepared a place in the wilderness. Who went into the wilderness before, right? The nation of Israel. And Jesus was God, but he was also a descendant of David from the nation of Israel. So there's a place prepared. She's fed there and taken care of for 1,260 days. How long is that? Well, we can't count that by our years. We have to count it by the years in the Jewish calendar, where every month has 30 days. So you really divide this out, it turns out to be 42 months. And that turns out to be a period of 3.5 years, which is half of the tribulation period. Verse 7. And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought. Oh my goodness. Folks, this is a war like you've never been seen down on this planet so far. First off, it was up in heaven. This war was so bad the planet couldn't have survived it. Don't know what kind of weapons were used there, but we do know what happened. Let's find out what happened. Verse 8. They did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So that great dragon, representing Satan, and his angels were kicked out of heaven for good. He could not come back. Just think about it. All these centuries since Christ, he wanted to go before God and criticize us and bring charges against us. Nope, he can't do that. He's down here. He's not up there, and he has no way to get back up there. Okay, that great dragon. Verse 8. Again, cast out. Verse 9. So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan. Now that very clearly identifies the great dragon, who deceives the whole world. Well, that's been his job down through all these millennia, and he does work consistently at it. He doesn't ever get tired. He's not a slacker. But that's what he does, is to deceive the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Then, verse 10, I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before our God day and night, has been cast down. Okay. He is no longer up there to be able to accuse the brethren. And we're part of the brethren. The righteous Jewish people were part of the brethren. Verse 11. Let's find out how this fight is won. That's critical to us to know. We're in the greatest spiritual battle in this nation that we've been since it was founded. And a lot of us that are not very much pacifist would love to just go out and take the sword and the guns and the artillery, and for that matter the nukes, and destroy all the evil. But that puppy doesn't hunt. That isn't how it gets done. How does it get done? Let's find out. Verse 11 says, they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death. If you want to overcome the power of Satan, and if you've been redeemed, you should be wanting to, because we're not perfect yet. But if you want to overcome it, You do it by the blood of the Lamb. You do it by constantly recognizing that the only claim you have is due to Jesus' sacrifice. And you do it by the word of your testimony. Now, testimony is a legal term here, like a court term. If you've ever been called as a witness in court, you know that they don't accept secondhand knowledge. It's got to be something you personally have experienced. What have you personally experienced since you came to Christ? That's the word of your testimony. Your testimony is given by your actions since then, by your proclaiming that God is the one that kept you from doing this and persuaded you to do this, and by your proclaiming the Word of God. And there's this other little factor that gets a little harder for some of us to think about up front, because we don't like to think about being killed because of our testimony, but it's very possible it could happen. And it's going to happen worldwide. It's going to happen right in this nation. On a very small scale, it already does, and it does around the world, and not such a small scale, but that scale is going to be bigger. Do you love your life so much that you will forsake your faith in order to save your life down here? You're going to die anyhow, dude. You're going to die anyhow. You might not get the sword, you might not get put to death, you might not get your head chopped off, you might not get burned at the stake, but you're going to die anyhow. And the consequences are eternal. But there are those who are truly redeemed. They've been that way down since history. Just study martyrdom sometime and find out. And they didn't love their lives to the death. And that is how we overcome. Verse 12. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Oh my goodness. The heavens rejoice every single time a sinner gets saved. But this is a mass rejoicing. But then there comes the second half of verse 12. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea. Well, my goodness, we've already had a couple of big woes. W-O-E, not W-O-A-H. Sad things are happening. Why? Woe to the inhabitants of the earth, for the devil has come down to you having great wrath, because he knows that he has a short time. He doesn't know how long that time is. God does. The devil doesn't. But he knows it's short, and he knows it's getting shorter. Verse 13, Now when the dragon saw that he'd been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. Yeah? If you think about the male child being Jesus, Israel has been persecuted down through the centuries ever since, mostly by minions of Satan. But what happens? Verse 14. The woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time. A year and 2 years and half a year, 3.5 years, from the presence of the serpent. The serpent didn't take this too good. Verse 15, So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. Now, if you think about this woman as being the bride of Jesus, which is another way we can think, then this woman is the church. I'm not talking about a building. I'm talking about all the true believers together, the ecclesiasta, the true believers, and the flood that has come of water out of his mouth has been a flood down through the centuries of false teaching. If you can't get somebody to just deny something by flat out lying to them, then the next way that you try to do it is sneak it in a little bit at a time. You mix it. A little Christianity, a little bit of Canaanitism, Canaanite, a little bit of Christianity, a little bit of Hindu, a little bit of Christianity, and mixed with a little Islam, a little bit of Confucianism mixed with it, little bit of false doctrine here and there and yonder, and oh my gosh, in all the false teachings that have been done down over the centuries, there's been a multitude of them. Verse 16, but the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood, which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. Then the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring, who kept the commandments of God and had the testimony of Jesus Christ. He doesn't give up. He doesn't surrender until it's taken by force. God willing, next week we'll continue on with the next chapter, chapter 13 of this, and we meet another great beast at that point in time. Think about this during the week, though. Pray about it. Pray that you might be in a position where if your faith is tested to the absolute limit and you have to die for it, that you're looking forward to what's going to happen so much that it doesn't really bother you. Pray for government leaders, even those that are sold out, it appears, to the enemy. Some of them probably truly are sold out. They're the wicked that won't ever be redeemed. But some of them might be gotten, and that might help some. Might slow things down a bit anyhow. Pray for the leaders in the church. You think you get persecuted by the enemy. You hadn't even begun to think about it if you're sitting back in the congregation. You get a deacon, you get an elder, you get a missionary, you get a prophet, you get an apostle, you get a preacher, you get any of these people that really get up and try to do God's work in the church, and the enemy comes against them even more. Pray for your families. There's not probably a single person that listens to this that doesn't have members of their family that don't know the Lord. Keep it up. The effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. That's what the Word tells us. So that's it for this week. God bless. Have a blessed day. Bye-bye.